Max had spent his entire life in service, but now, as he lay in the corner of the living room, there was an unfamiliar quiet. The constant hum of sirens and the sharp commands of his handler were gone. The days of running down criminals, guarding important locations, and using his nose to detect danger seemed like distant memories. Now he was just a dog, a retired police dog, struggling to find his place in a world that no longer needed him in the same way. He had been with Officer Jack Turner for nearly 8 years, working as a K-9 unit. Max had been trained to detect drugs, chase down suspects, and even apprehend criminals when the situation called for it. But Jack had been injured in a raid, and after a long period of recovery, it became clear that Jack wouldn't be able to continue his work as a police officer. He retired, and so did Max. At first, Max had been confused. He had no idea why they weren't going to work every day anymore. The routine had been everything to him. Wake up, go to work, and repeat. He had always known his role and had performed it with pride. Now, the house was too quiet and the days felt long. Jack, still recovering physically and mentally from the accident, was home more often, but he had changed. The bond they shared during their years on the force had always been strong, but now Max noticed Jack seemed distant at times. Maybe it was the injuries, or maybe it was the realization that his purpose was now something different. Max had always been a dog of action, always alert, always ready. But now there was nothing to do, nothing to protect, nothing to hunt. The walls of the house, once just a backdrop for his work, now felt like a cage. It was in the middle of this confusion that Jack's wife Sarah came into the room one evening, holding a small bundle in her arms. "Max," Sarah said softly, her voice warm and comforting, "meet Emily." Max lifted his head from his paws, his ears twitching. He could sense something new in the room, something different. The small baby in Sarah's arms looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. Her tiny fingers twitched in the air, and her face was full of wonder as she studied the large dog lying in front of her. Max didn't move, but he watched the baby carefully. Emily was so small, so fragile. He could hear the quiet rhythm of her breathing, see the soft rise and fall of her chest. He didn't know exactly what she was, but he could tell she was important, important to Jack, and now, by extension, important to him. "Max," Sarah said, gently nudging him with her voice, "this is Emily. She's going to be part of the family now, just like you. She's going to need you, you know." Max didn't understand the full meaning of her words, but he could sense the sincerity in her tone. Sarah seemed to want him to pay attention, to understand that this tiny human was something special. Max had been trained to protect, to care for, but this was different. There was no command, no signal to follow. This was a different kind of responsibility. As Sarah set Emily down on the blanket beside him, Max sniffed the air carefully. There was a soft, unfamiliar scent around her, one that made his nostrils twitch. It wasn't unpleasant, but it was new. He lowered his head, his eyes focused on the little girl. Emily cooed and wiggled her fingers at him, giggling. Max's tail thumped gently against the floor as he considered her. She was so small, so delicate, and yet there was something about the way she looked at him that made him feel a little less lost. "Max," Sarah said again, her voice softer this time, "she's going to need you to be her protector, just like you've protected us all these years." Max shifted his body slightly, still uncertain. Protect her? He had spent his life protecting adults, people who could defend themselves, who understood the dangers of the world. But this tiny creature, she couldn't even walk yet. She couldn't even talk. But as Emily gazed at him, her eyes wide with innocence, Max felt a stirring deep in his chest, a feeling he had never quite experienced before. It wasn't the sharp focus of duty that he had felt in the line of service. It was something softer, something deeper, The instinct to protect, yes, but it was accompanied by a sense of calm, of patience that he had never known. Over the next few weeks, Max began to adjust to this new role. He watched Emily carefully, always keeping a close eye on her as she grew. At first, it was a strange experience. He didn't know what to do with her tiny hands that would occasionally reach out to touch his fur, but over time he realized that Emily didn't want to hurt him. She wasn't a threat. She was just a little person, full of curiosity and wonder. And she needed him. Emily was learning to crawl, and one day, as she wiggled her way toward him on the floor, Max felt a strange pull. He lay still, allowing her to come closer. When Emily reached him, she grabbed at his fur, tugging gently. Max didn't flinch. Instead, he tilted his head, watching her with patient eyes. "You're a good boy, Max," Jack said from the doorway, watching the scene unfold. "She likes you." Max's tail thumped against the floor again, a quiet acknowledgement. He didn't fully understand what was happening, but he knew one thing. He had a role in this family. A new role. And this little girl, with her small hands and innocent giggles, needed him in a way he had never expected. Max had spent his whole life as a protector of sorts, but now, he realized, his job was different. It wasn't about chasing criminals or keeping people safe from danger. It was about being there, being present, and offering the quiet comfort that only a dog like him could provide. As the days went by, Max and Emily formed a bond, a quiet understanding that didn't need words. Whenever she cried, Max would be there, lying beside her crib, his presence a silent reassurance. Whenever she smiled, he would wag his tail, offering her the gentleness she needed. And as she grew stronger and her tiny hands began to explore the world, Max remained her constant protector, steady, reliable, and ever watchful. Jack, who had been uncertain about the future after his injury, watched this bond develop with a quiet pride. He could see that Max was finding a new purpose, just as he had. The dog, who had once patrolled the streets with him, had once saved his life on more than one occasion, was now saving him again, by helping him rediscover the joy of family, of purpose, and of love. Max had always been a dog of action, but now he was learning that sometimes the most important thing you can do is just be there. Weeks had passed since Emily's arrival into Max's world, and each day felt like a new chapter in the quiet journey they were both on. Emily was growing rapidly, her small hands now reaching for anything they could grasp, and her baby giggles were a sound Max had grown to adore. Though it had been strange at first, Max had found comfort in the routine of their days, comfort in knowing that Emily was always near, always needing his protection and companionship. He'd spent most of his life on high alert, tuned to every shift in his environment, but now things had slowed down. He no longer had the rush of chasing suspects or the urgency of a police call. Instead, Max's days were marked by the simple rhythms of family life, the early morning sunlight that spilled into the living room, the soft voice of Sarah calling him to join them for breakfast, the afternoon naps on the couch where Emily would curl up next to him, her tiny fingers threading through his fur as she drifted off to sleep. Max had come to understand that his role had shifted. He wasn't just the strong, disciplined police dog anymore. He was now the quiet protector of this young family, especially of Emily, who had become his center of attention. It was a sunny afternoon when the next milestone arrived. Emily, now almost a year old, had begun to take her first steps. Sarah had been encouraging her, holding her hands and coaxing her to walk, but Max had been there, watching intently, his body low to the ground as if he could sense the importance of the moment. "Come on, Emily," Sarah said gently, a smile on her face. "Just one more step." Emily looked at her mother with wide, trusting eyes, then, with a burst of determination, lifted her tiny foot and took one wobbly step forward. The room seemed to hold its breath for a moment, and then she took another step, Max's ears perked, up at the sound of Emily's delighted squeal. She giggled, stumbling a bit, and reached for Sarah's outstretched arms. Sarah pulled her into a warm embrace, her joy radiating as she kissed the top of Emily's head. "Good girl, Emily. You did it!" Sarah exclaimed. Max, not one for many vocal expressions, couldn't help but wag his tail, thumping it against the floor in approval. He had witnessed Emily's first step, and though he couldn't comprehend it in the way that humans could, he knew that this was significant. "Hey, Max, what do you think?" Jack's voice called from the kitchen, where he'd been tidying up after lunch. He walked into the living room, his eyes landing on the smiling family and the triumphant baby. Max got up from his spot, tail still wagging as he approached Jack, his movements steady and careful. "Max saw it all, didn't you, buddy?" Jack said with a soft chuckle, kneeling down to ruffle Max's fur. Max licked his hand affectionately, sensing Jack's contentment. Jack had been quiet lately, still adjusting to the idea of retirement, still learning how to be a father rather than a police officer, but moments like these helped fill the space between him and the rest of the family. Max glanced at Emily again. She was now on her knees, reaching out for the space in front of her with a growing curiosity. The world was wide and unknown to her, and she was taking her first steps into it with wonder. Max watched over her protectively, instinctively staying close as she made her way forward. "Isn't it amazing?" Sarah whispered almost to herself. "She's growing so fast." Jack nodded, then reached out and gently scratched Max behind the ears. "I think we owe a lot of that to you, old boy." Max didn't fully understand the depth of Jack's words, but he felt a warmth spread through him, a quiet understanding that they were all beginning to come together as a family, and that he was an essential part of it. His work now wasn't as clear-cut as it had once been, but he was still making a difference. As the days passed, Max and Emily continued to bond. Max had learned the rhythm of her movements, her giggles when he approached, her chubby hands reaching for his ears, her tiny feet taking clumsy steps toward him as she grew more confident. Max was always there, a silent presence beside her, watching over her as she explored her world. It wasn't just about protection anymore, Max realized. It was about companionship. He had once been content to work alone, to focus on his mission. But now, in Emily's eyes, he found something new, a quiet joy that didn't require chasing criminals or solving problems. It was the simple act of being there, of being a steady presence in a world that was constantly changing. One afternoon, after a day spent in the backyard, Emily had fallen asleep in Sarah's arms, her tiny body resting against her mother's chest. Max lay beside them on the porch, his eyes half closed in the peaceful warmth of the moment. He had always been an active dog, but now he had come to appreciate the quiet moments. Jack sat beside him, leaning back in his chair, his eyes distant but content. "You know, Max," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I was worried about you. I thought you'd be lost without the job, but I think you found something more important now." Max turned his head slightly, looking up at Jack with soft, understanding eyes. He didn't need words to know what Jack meant. The bond between them, forged through years of service and sacrifice, had deepened in a new way. And now, that bond extended to Emily, the tiny human who had brought a new purpose to Max's life. Jack reached out and scratched Max's head, his fingers weaving through the thick fur. "I'm glad you're here with us," he murmured. "You're more than just a working dog, you're family." Max's tail gave a soft thump against the floor, a quiet acknowledgement of Jack's words. It was all he could offer, but it was enough. The days continued to pass, and Max found himself growing more and more comfortable in his new role. He no longer felt lost in the quiet of retirement. Emily had become his new mission, his new purpose. He was there to guide her, to protect her, and to be a steady presence as she took her first steps into the world. And in turn, she had given him a sense of fulfillment that went beyond his years of service as a police dog. Max had learned that while the work he had once known may have ended, his journey was far from over. It was simply changing, evolving, and with Emily by his side, it was more meaningful than ever. The days were growing warmer as spring settled in, filling the house with sunlight that spilled in through the windows, casting soft golden rays across the living room floor. Max had adapted to the slower pace of life, the quiet moments that now defined his existence. His days were spent watching over Emily, keeping her company, and being the steady presence he had always been, only now without the uniform and the badge. In return, Emily's tiny hands reached for him every chance she got, her giggles filling the air whenever she managed to crawl toward him or touch his fur. But life, as Max had come to learn, wasn't always predictable. One afternoon, as the family played in the backyard, a loud noise broke through the air, a sharp, unfamiliar sound that made Max's ears snap upright, his body going rigid as his instincts kicked in. It wasn't just the sound that made Max alert, it was the scent that followed. Something wasn't right. His nose twitched, catching a faint odor of smoke and something else, something chemical, unnatural. His muscles tensed, and he instinctively stood up, his posture shifting from the relaxed comfort of a retired dog to the alert readiness of the canine he had once been. "Max?" Jack asked, noticing his sudden shift in behavior. He had been kneeling beside Emily, helping her build a small tower of blocks, but now he looked at the dog, sensing the change. "What's wrong, buddy?" Max's eyes darted toward the edge of the yard, his gaze locked on the line of trees at the far end. His nose was telling him something. There was danger nearby. He growled low in his throat, a deep rumbling sound that made Jack's instincts stir. "Stay here with him," Jack ordered, his voice low and calm. He had always known that Max was more than just a dog. He was an alert, intelligent companion who could read situations like no other. Without hesitation, Jack stood and moved toward the edge of the yard, his eyes scanning the area for any sign of trouble. Max watched Jack's every move, but he didn't back down. His paws were planted firmly on the ground, his ears flicked forward, his body tense. Something was coming. Sarah, who had been sitting on the porch, saw the shift in the air. She stood up, walking cautiously toward the fence where Jack was now crouching, peering through the trees. "What is it?" she asked, her voice carrying a hint of concern. "I'm not sure yet," Jack replied, his eyes narrowing. "I think something's out there. I don't want to take any chances," Max barked, the sound sharp and commanding. Jack, hearing the urgency in his dog's voice, quickly motioned for Sarah to stay back. "Take Emily inside now," he said. Sarah hesitated, glancing down at their daughter, who was still playing with her toys by the porch. But Emily was safe, and Sarah understood. She scooped up the baby, holding her close as she made her way back toward the house. Max stayed at Jack's side, his focus unwavering. He had spent years working in high-stakes situations, but now, with Emily's safety on the line, something inside him shifted. He was still a protector, and his sense of duty hadn't disappeared. If there was danger, he would face it head-on. As Sarah entered the house, locking the door behind her, Jack moved closer to the tree line, his hand resting on the gun holstered at his side. He trusted Max more than anyone in this world, and if his dog was reacting this way, there was definitely something out of place. Then, just as quickly as the noise had come, it grew louder, closer. A figure emerged from the trees, a man in a heavy jacket, his face hidden by a hood. Jack's hand instinctively went to his gun, but he hesitated. The man hadn't yet posed a direct threat. Still, Jack wasn't about to let his guard down. Max growled again, stepping forward protectively, his posture tense and watchful. His instincts were screaming that this was a danger to his family, and he wasn't wrong. The man took a slow step forward, and Jack's eyes narrowed. He had seen enough trouble in his career to know that not all threats came in the form of criminals or burglars. Some people were just looking for trouble, looking for a chance to break into something they didn't understand. "Who are you?" Jack called, his voice firm, trying to assert control over the situation without escalating things further. The man didn't answer, his eyes scanning the yard before locking onto Jack. Max barked, a clear warning. The man took a half-step back, his hands raised in a sign of peace, but his expression was unreadable. Max didn't wait. He charged forward with a sharp bark, and in that instant the man bolted, running back into the woods at full speed. "Max!" "No," Jack called, but it was too late. Max had already pursued the man, his legs strong and swift as he moved through the brush, following the scent of the intruder with unwavering precision. Jack stood frozen for a moment, his heart pounding. He knew Max was fast, but this wasn't like the old days. He didn't have backup, and his body wasn't in the same shape it had been when he was patrolling the streets. He had to make sure everything was okay with Sarah and Emily before following Max into the woods. Inside the house, Sarah was sitting on the couch with Emily in her arms, the baby babbling softly. She looked up at Jack as he entered, his face serious. "What's happening?" she asked. "I don't know yet," Jack said, but his voice was calm. "I think we had an intruder." "I thought I heard something earlier," Sarah said, her voice shaking slightly. "You didn't—" "I'll be fine," Jack assured her. "Just stay here with Emily." Max was still out there, and Jack knew he couldn't risk being too far from his dog. Without another word, he grabbed a flashlight and his jacket, ready to head back outside. Max had always been a dog of action, and Jack trusted him with his life. The situation was tense, but he knew that Max was doing exactly what he was trained to do, protect his family, and Jack wasn't about to let his partner down. Jack stepped out into the cool evening air, the weight of his jacket settling against his shoulders. The sun had dipped behind the trees, casting long shadows across the yard. Inside, Sarah was tending to Emily, both of them safe, for now. But Jack's concern for Max and the possible intruder still loomed heavy in the air. He was moving with purpose now, following the edge of the woods where he'd seen the man disappear moments ago. The underbrush crunched under his boots, but the woods were eerily quiet, save for the occasional rustle of branches and the distant chirp of crickets. Max had a lead on the intruder. Jack could sense it. His canine partner had always been relentless. When it came to a chase, and the man would have no way of outrunning Max in these woods, Jack knew the area well enough to know that there were paths, thick brush, and even small clearings Max could use to his advantage. But if he wasn't careful, the situation could escalate quickly. "Max," Jack murmured under his breath as he pushed through the foliage, keeping his eyes peeled for any sign of movement. The farther he went, the denser the forest became. The faint smell of smoke had dissipated, replaced by the earthy scent of damp leaves and pine. Jack slowed his pace, carefully listening for any sounds that might hint at Max's position. A bark echoed through the trees, sharp, commanding, followed by the sound of hurried movement. Jack's pulse quickened. He pushed forward, the adrenaline in his veins guiding him. There was no hesitation now. Max was onto something, and Jack needed to be there, ready to back him up. He finally broke into a small clearing, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The trees opened up into a wider space, but it was empty, save for a few fallen logs and scattered rocks. Jack's heart dropped into his stomach. Where was Max? "Max!" Jack called, his voice carrying through the night. He could feel the tension rising in his chest, and then he heard it, the faintest rustle of leaves behind him. He spun around just in time to see Max burst through the brush, his body low to the ground, muscles taut. His coat gleamed in the flashlight's beam, and his eyes locked onto Jack with a focused intensity. There was no sign of the intruder, but Max's demeanor told Jack everything he needed to know. The chase had been long, but Max was still tracking the man. He hadn't stopped. He was still searching. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good boy, Max," he whispered, crouching down to meet the dog's gaze. Max's tail thumped once against the ground, but he remained still, his ears perked, listening, scanning the area for any movement. He wasn't satisfied. There was more to this. "Where did he go?" Jack muttered, more to himself than Max. He stood up, scanning the trees once again. Max let out a low growl, his body rigid, eyes trained on a small patch of underbrush to their left. Jack's instincts flared, and he moved toward the spot, his hand resting once more on the gun at his side. Whatever was out there was still a threat. "Stay with me, Max," Jack commanded, his voice firm but calm. Max responded without hesitation, stepping closer to Jack's side, his movements deliberate. Together, they advanced toward the dense thicket. Jack's flashlight swept through the shadows, the beam catching on something, a glimmer of metal half buried in the leaves. He knelt down, shining the light directly on the object. A small, discarded knife, its blade reflecting in the light. Jack's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't just a random trespasser. This was someone who had come prepared. And Max had been right to sense the danger. "Let's go, Max," Jack said, his tone growing more urgent. He needed to find the intruder, figure out who he was, and make sure he wasn't a threat to his family. The knife was a warning, one that Jack couldn't ignore. Max immediately shifted into motion, moving faster now, pushing through the brush with Jack close behind. The trail was clearer now. Broken branches, disturbed leaves, and the faint scent of sweat mixed with the lingering trace of chemicals. They were getting closer. Suddenly, Max stopped dead in his tracks, his body stiffening. Jack barely had time to register the change before a voice came from the shadows. "Easy, officer," a gravelly voice called, a hint of mockery in it. "I'm not here to cause any trouble." Jack's hand went to his gun again, but Max stepped in front of him, a silent warning to the man hidden in the trees. The dog was as steadfast as ever, no longer just a police dog, but a protector, guarding Jack and his family. The man stepped into the light, his face partially obscured by the hood of his jacket. He was tall, lean, with scruffy facial hair. His eyes were dark, hard to read, but there was something off about him, something that told Jack this wasn't just some innocent wanderer. "I said I'm not here to cause trouble," the man repeated, his tone slow, almost casual. "I just need a place to lay low for a while. Wasn't expecting anyone to be living out here." "You trespassed on private property," Jack said, his voice sharp, the authority in it unmistakable. "You've got about 10 seconds to explain why I shouldn't call the police before I decide to handle this myself." Max growled low, his body still blocking Jack, ready to defend him at a moment's notice. The intruder didn't seem intimidated, but there was a flicker of something, nervousness maybe, behind his eyes. "I'm not a threat," the man said, his voice wavering slightly. I've got nowhere else to go." Jack didn't buy it. "You've got a knife, and you've been lurking around my property. That's a problem." Max's low growl rumbled. Again, as if agreeing with Jack's assessment, the man hesitated, glancing down at Max and then back at Jack. There was no more bravado in his posture. I'm sorry, I'm lost. Don't have anywhere to turn. I wasn't trying to hurt anyone." Jack kept his stance firm. "You're trespassing. I don't care what your reasons are. You need to leave now. And if I ever see you again—" "I won't be as lenient." Max's eyes never left the man, his growl still a soft warning, and Jack felt a small measure of relief. The man had been caught, but he hadn't escalated the situation. The man nodded quickly, taking a step back. "I get it. I'll go." Jack didn't lower his guard until the man turned and disappeared into the woods, vanishing into the night. Max stood still, his eyes scanning the trees one final time before he turned back to Jack, his body relaxing slightly. Jack sighed, a mix of frustration and relief. "Good job, Max," he said, his voice softening. "Let's go home." Max wagged his tail, once a quiet signal of contentment as he trotted back toward Jack's side. They had done their job. No one had been hurt, and the danger had passed, at least for now. As they walked back through the woods, Jack's mind replayed the incident. He had been prepared for a threat, but in the end, it had been a man with nowhere else to turn. But Jack wasn't about to take any chances when it came to his family. And Max had once again proven that his loyalty was unwavering, his protection second to none. When they reached the house, Jack looked back at Max. "Thanks, buddy," he said, softly, his voice full of gratitude. "You kept us safe." Max gave a small huff of acknowledgement and lay down at the door, his head resting on his paws, content and watchful, as always. The night settled in around them, calm once again. And Jack, Sarah, Emily and Max knew that they were safe, together. The next few days passed in relative peace, but the tension of the previous encounter still hung in the air, lingering like the last traces of a storm. Jack couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that came from seeing the man in the woods, and though nothing had happened since, he kept his guard up. Max, ever the loyal companion, remained by his side, a quiet presence, as though aware that the peace they had now was fragile. But it wasn't just the brush with danger that weighed on Jack's mind. As the days went on, he noticed something subtle, something important, that was happening between Max and Emily. The connection they shared was growing stronger. Max, despite being retired and out of his usual element, had found a new role, a new purpose. The dog who once served on the front lines of the police force was now the guardian of a young family, a protector not just of his handler, but of a little girl who was learning the world with wide-eyed curiosity. Max seemed to instinctively know that his role had shifted. He wasn't just a dog anymore. He was part of their family, part of their story. Emily, for her part, was becoming more and more enchanted by Max's presence. At only a year and a half, she was still learning to walk, still figuring out how to navigate the world around her. But Max had been there through it all, offering steady companionship and quiet moments of reassurance. Every time she toddled toward him, giggling as she reached for his fur, Max seemed to soften, lowering his head so she could touch him. Jack watched them one morning, seated on the couch as Emily and Max played. The sunlight streamed in through the open windows, and he couldn't help but smile as Emily laughed, trying to crawl onto Max's back. "Careful there, Em," Jack said, his voice gentle, though he knew there was no danger. Max was calm, his eyes full of patience, as Emily attempted to balance on his back. To Jack's surprise, Max stayed still, his tail thumping once against the floor as Emily climbed onto him, her tiny hands gripping the soft fur of his shoulders. "Good boy, Max," Jack murmured, his heart swelling with pride. He could see it now, the bond they shared, the trust that was being built between them. It wasn't just a matter of Max protecting the family anymore. He was also growing into the role of a companion, one who was patient, gentle, and incredibly aware of Emily's every movement. It was around that moment that Jack realized that Max had become more than just a dog in their lives. Max was a bridge. He was the connection between Jack's past as a police officer and his future as a father. The bond that had been forged in the field had now extended into their home, providing a steady foundation for the family. The next day, as Jack was sitting at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, he watched Max and Emily out the window. She was outside, toddling around the yard in her oversized boots, with Max following closely behind, walking beside her at a pace that matched her every step. Jack felt a pang of warmth in his chest. They were a family now. Max had not just adapted to this new life, he had embraced it, and Jack had grown to realize just how much he had needed Max. The transition from working on the police force to being a stay-at-home dad had been a difficult one for him, But Max had been there through it all, providing the support and loyalty that had been so familiar to him in his old line of work. "Hey, Sarah," Jack called, turning toward his wife as she came into the kitchen. "Come look at this." She stepped up beside him, following his gaze out the window. Max and Emily were in the yard now, playing together. Emily was holding onto Max's collar, laughing as she tried to pull him around in a circle. Max, for his part, was trotting obediently beside her, his tail wagging slowly. "Look at them," Jack said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I think Max has really found his place here, huh?" Sarah's eyes softened as she looked out the window. "I think you're right," she replied, her voice tender. "He's not just a guard dog anymore, he's part of our family." Jack nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. He felt a sense of fulfillment, something he hadn't experienced in a long time. He had been worried about how Max would adjust to civilian life, about how their bond might change after leaving the police force. But now, watching Max and Emily together, he knew the dog had found a new purpose. "Max has always had a heart for people," Sarah said, her hand resting on Jack's shoulder. "And now he's got Emily to look after." Jack chuckled, a soft, contented sound. "You could say he's got his paws full." But as he watched Max with Emily, Jack knew that it wasn't just about the dog watching over the little girl. Max was giving something to Emily that would shape her childhood, something more than just protection or companionship. It was trust, it was love, and it was a quiet, unwavering presence that Emily would carry with her throughout her life. That evening, after dinner, Jack found himself sitting on the porch, the last remnants of sunlight fading behind the trees. Max lay at his feet as usual, but this time Jack found himself reaching down to scratch the dog's ears, a small gesture, but one full of appreciation. Max lifted his head, his eyes meeting Jack's. He gave a small huff, as if to say, "You're welcome," before returning to his relaxed position, content to be in the quiet comfort of the evening. Jack looked out at the horizon, the weight of the day easing from his shoulders. He had spent so many years working in a high-stress environment, always on the move, always chasing something, whether it was a criminal or an investigation. But now, here in this small, peaceful corner of the world, he realized that the chase was over. The reward wasn't something that could be measured in medals or accolades. It was this, a family, a home, and a loyal dog who had made it all possible. "You've done good, Max," Jack whispered, his voice quiet but filled with gratitude. "You've done real good." Max's tail thumped once more, his eyes closing in contentment as he rested against Jack's feet, and in that moment, everything felt right. The adjustment had been difficult, but it was worth it. Max was home, and Jack knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. Him, his family, and the dog who had proven that loyalty and love could transform even the hardest of transitions into something beautiful. The seasons changed slowly at first. Spring bled into summer, and with it came longer days and warmer nights. The yard, once green and lush with spring rain, began to dry under the hot sun, but it was still a place of comfort, a space for Emily to roam and Max to keep watch. Jack had come to cherish these quieter moments, where the rush of police work and the weight of responsibility felt like distant memories. Life had settled into a gentle rhythm. The early mornings were filled with the soft murmur of a family waking up, and the evenings with the scent of dinner simmering on the stove. Max, ever faithful, stayed close to Jack and Sarah, a silent but constant presence in their home. His paws had left an imprint on the soft wood of their kitchen floor, and his fur, now graying at the edges, was a reminder of the years he had served with Jack. But there was still a part of Jack that occasionally wondered if Max was truly content. The dog had given up a life of purpose, of chasing criminals, of protecting those who needed him most. And now he spent his days chasing after a toddler, watching over her like a shadow. The work was different. But was it enough? Jack had seen firsthand the toll a dog's work could take, the unspoken weight of a life lived on high alert. Was Max truly happy here? Did he miss the adrenaline of his old life? The question lingered in Jack's mind more than he cared to admit. One afternoon, Jack decided to take Max on a long walk through the woods, the same woods they had patrolled together during Jack's last years on the force. The air was warm but thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers, and as they walked, Jack felt a sense of nostalgia creeping in. The dog beside him, despite his grey hairs, still walked with the same purposeful gait. There was a sense of pride in Max's step, the way his head stayed high, his eyes scanning the path ahead as though he was still on duty. Jack paused for a moment, looking down at Max. "You miss it, don't you?" he asked quietly, unsure if the dog could understand. But Max looked up at him, his tail swaying slowly, as if acknowledging the question. There was something in his gaze, a flicker of recognition, a shared understanding. They continued walking, the soft crunch of leaves beneath their feet the only sound accompanying them. The path twisted and turned, and Max led the way, his body alert, his ears twitching at every rustle in the trees. Jack's thoughts wandered as they moved deeper into the woods, and for a brief moment it felt as if they were back in their old routine, dog and handler moving as one through the unknown. It wasn't until they reached a clearing that Jack realized how far they had gone. The sun was beginning to dip, casting long shadows across the ground. Max stopped and turned to Jack, his posture shifting. The dog's eyes flicked toward the distant tree line, and Jack could see the change in him, his muscles tensing, his body instinctively preparing for something. "Easy, Max," Jack murmured, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his side, even though he didn't think he would need it. Still, he trusted Max's instincts more than anyone else's. If the dog was sensing something, there was no way Jack would ignore it. Suddenly there was movement, a rustle in the brush, a shadow flitting between the trees. Jack's heart rate picked up, and he instinctively took a step closer to Max, who was now growling low in his throat. The tension in the air was palpable. It was the same feeling Jack had experienced countless times before, when Max was keyed into something, when the danger was real, but it was still a mystery. "Stay," Jack commanded softly, his voice low and steady. Max obeyed, his growl subsiding into a quiet rumble as he stood in place, eyes never leaving the tree line. Then, through the trees, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and wiry, his face partially obscured by a hood. He was walking toward them, unsteady but purposeful. Jack immediately recognized the man from the incident a few weeks ago, the one who had trespassed on their property. The man's eyes flicked between Jack and Max, his gaze uncertain, but tinged with a sense of familiarity. "I didn't mean to," he started, but the words were interrupted by the deep rumble of Max's growl. "Back off," Jack said firmly, his voice filled with authority. He took a step forward, positioning himself between the intruder and Max. "You're not welcome here." The man raised his hands in a gesture of surrender. "I'm not here to cause any trouble," he said, his voice strained. "I swear, I just need help." Jack studied him carefully, his mind racing. He had no intention of letting this man back into his life, but something about the desperation in his voice made Jack pause. Max remained tense beside him, his eyes locked on the man. But there was a flicker of recognition in the way the dog stood. This wasn't just any stranger to him. This was the same man who had fled before, the one who had tried to hide in the woods. "Help with what?" Jack asked, keeping his tone firm but not unkind. The man hesitated before speaking again. "I've got nowhere to go. I've been staying in the woods. I don't want trouble, but I don't have any choice. Can you just give me a place to stay for the night?" Max's growl grew louder, and Jack could feel the tension building. He glanced down at his partner. Max was in full protective mode, and Jack knew that the dog saw this man as a potential threat. "I'm sorry," Jack said, his voice cold now, "but you need to leave. We've already had one run-in with you, and I won't let it happen again." The man's face twisted in frustration, but he didn't push. Instead, he took a few steps back, his eyes never leaving Jack and Max. Fine," he muttered. "But you won't see me again, I promise." Jack watched as the man disappeared back into the woods, the soft rustle of his footsteps soon fading away. Max didn't relax until the man was completely out of sight, and even then the dog remained alert, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. Jack exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Good job, Max," he said quietly, his voice filled with a mix of relief and frustration. Max turned to look at Jack, his body still tense, but the growl had stopped. He was still on alert, but there was an understanding in his eyes now. Jack had made the right decision. The walk back home was quiet, the woods around them calm once more. Max walked beside Jack, his presence a constant reassurance, as it had been through so many other trials. The encounter had tested something in Jack, his trust, his ability to read situations, and his loyalty to his family. But through it all, Max had proven once again that even in uncertain times, he was the steadfast protector, the partner who would always have Jack's back, and Jack knew, with certainty, that no matter what came next, he and Max would face it. Together, the days following the tense encounter in the woods felt both longer and shorter in the same breath. Jack kept a careful eye on the house, and though nothing more came of the man from the woods, he felt a lingering unease. The peaceful, quiet life they had built was still fragile, but Max, ever loyal and watchful, provided an unspoken reassurance that Jack could trust. That night, after putting Emily to bed and settling into the familiar comfort of their living room, Jack found himself reflecting on how much had changed since he retired from the force. The adrenaline, the chaos, the constant need for vigilance, those were things he had come to miss. But in their place, he'd found something even more rewarding: a family, a home, and a bond with Max that ran deeper than any of the missions. They'd faced together. Max lay at his feet, content in the quiet of the room. The old dog had adapted well to his new life, but Jack wondered, as he had so many times before, if Max would ever fully let go of the memories from their time on the force. Would he always carry the weight of those days with him? As if sensing Jack's thoughts, Max lifted his head, his eyes locking with his handler's. For a moment they simply stared at each other, and in that silent exchange, Jack understood. Max didn't need the old life. He didn't need the flashing lights or the sirens or the chase. He needed his family. He needed Jack and Sarah and Emily, and they needed him just as much. The sound of a small giggle broke Jack from his reverie. He turned to see Emily, standing in the doorway, her tiny hands gripping the frame as she peered into the room. Her eyes were wide, and she looked at Max, then Jack, before letting out another giggle. "Max!" she exclaimed, her voice still soft and full of wonder. Jack smiled, his heart melting at the sight of his daughter. "What's up, Em?" he asked gently. The toddler waddled into the room, her little feet making soft pattering sounds on the wooden floor. Max raised his head, his tail beginning to wag as Emily made her way toward him. She reached out, her tiny hands trying to touch Max's fur, a look of pure joy on her face. "Max," she repeated, a giggle escaping her lips. Jack watched the scene unfold, his chest tightening with emotion. Max, despite his graying muzzle and his aging body, was still the same dog who had once chased criminals through the streets. But now he was the protector of this little girl, the one who would watch over her as she grew, just as he had always watched over Jack. Max lowered his head, allowing Emily to reach him, her hands brushing his fur. It was as if the dog understood the importance of this moment. He wasn't just watching over Emily, he was teaching her something too. he was teaching her trust. Jack got up from the couch and approached them, his gaze never leaving the two of them. He knelt down beside Emily and Max, a hand resting on Max's back. "You two are a good team, aren't you?" he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Emily giggled again, leaning in to kiss Max on the head. The dog's eyes closed in contentment as he let her, his tail thumping softly against the floor. Jack took a deep breath, absorbing the peacefulness of the moment. In that instant, he realized just how far they had come. From the uncertainty of retirement to the fear of what the future might hold, to this moment, this quiet, simple moment of happiness, Max had been there every step of the way, guiding them through it all. "You've earned your rest, buddy," Jack said, his voice soft but full of gratitude. "You've earned it all." Max looked up at him then, his eyes wise and knowing. And for a second, it felt as though the dog was acknowledging the truth in Jack's words. As the evening wore on, the family settled into their nightly routine. Sarah came in from the kitchen carrying a tray of snacks, and the three of them sat together, Jack, Sarah, Max, and Emily, gathered in the living room, basking in the simple joy of being together. The world outside was quiet, the stars twinkling faintly through the windows, but inside there was warmth, there was love, and there was a sense of peace that Jack had never known before. Max lay by Emily's feet as they all watched a movie, the dog's eyes fluttering closed as he drifted off into a light sleep. Jack smiled, reaching down to scratch the dog's ears one last time before the night was over. "Good night, Max," he whispered. The dog's tail gave a soft thump, and Jack took it as the affirmation it was, the affirmation that Max was happy, here, that he had found his place, and that no matter what came next, they would face it together. As the family settled into the calm of the night, Jack knew that this chapter of their lives was just the beginning. The road ahead might not always be easy, but with Max by their side, they would face whatever came their way, together.